Hello there, welcome back to my new YouTube channel, Petrophysics Rocks. I thought I'd take this opportunity to rescue a few videos from my own website. They've been up there since 2010. I've been helping students catch up on their sleep for a number of years now. It's my Petrophysics for Dummies series, probably my most popular series. Got a couple of thousand views on my website, but I thought I'd introduce it to the wider YouTube audience. One of the things that I did on my website was I suggested that if you were interested and you found it useful, you could contribute to the Aberdeen Children's Hospital, the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary Children's Hospital, whose acronym rather appropriately is ARCHI, which is good for us petrophysicists. It's a great hospital, great setup they've got there, and well worth contributing to. So I would humbly ask you, if you would like to consider contributing, there's a link down below where you go to my Just Giving page, and whatever you can manage, nothing is too small, nothing is too large. I'd really appreciate it, and I'm sure the guys at the Archie Foundation would as well. There's also, whilst you're down there, you might as well click subscribe and do all the good YouTubey things. Perhaps maybe even leave a comment or some suggestions for me. That'll all help the YouTube algorithm. But let's kick this off. What I've done is I've sort of had this split up into a number of chapters. So we'll go through them one at a time. They're only 10, 15 minutes long each, and I'll put them together in a watch list, and hopefully that'll collate them all so that you can watch them more easily in a oneer. Or as I say, maybe just come back with a cup every coffee break for a week or whatever, then you'll plow through them quickly enough. I hope you'll find them interesting. As I say, it's for dummies, so anybody who finds this sort of stuff interesting, how we measure the amount of oil in our reservoirs down below. So let's kick off with the first one. Let's see, the first chapter, A Beginner's Guide to Petrophysics. Okay, well, good luck with it, and I'll catch up with you shortly. Welcome to my Beginner's Guide to Petrophysics. This presentation is aimed at non-technical people. It doesn't matter if you've never even heard of petrophysics before. Anybody who's interested perhaps in trying to understand how we measure the amount of oil in our oil fields, given that they're thousands of feet below the Earth's surface. How on earth would we go about making those sorts of measurements? This is based on a presentation that I made to the Aberdeen Formation Evaluation Society, together with a colleague of mine, Richard Fairbairn. We put on a little seminar for non-technical people. Now, this presentation, as I say, is aimed at a wide range of abilities and interests. And since we put the original seminar on, I've added a little bit of extra stuff on a thing called nuclear magnetic resonance. Now, don't worry about that too much. If you're interested, you can always watch. Otherwise, there's always the fast forward button on this machine for you to fast forward over if you need to. I should say that, of course, throughout any of this, if you do get bored, then unfortunately you only have yourself to blame, because access to the fast forward button is only a click away. Okay, I guess many of us could probably draw pictures like this. Any of the disciplines, we could all say that we're all at the center of everything and everybody is dependent on us and we are key players. But if you humor me just a little bit, we'll stick with this analogy and we'll say that the petrophysicist is working away at the rock face, sometimes quite literally, to try and describe the rocks and the reservoirs that oil companies try and exploit and find oil in. So our job is to quantify the quality of the rock, the quality of the reservoir, and how much oil we have in place. Now, we do this in a number of ways. Here are a set of tools that we use to make measurements in our
well bores, our oil field oil wells. We put these types of tools down the holes that we drill, and we make a number of measurements. And what I'd like to do in this presentation is just briefly outline the principles involved in some of these measurements. And if you're a school kid watching this and wondering why you need to know about certain things like neutrons and gamma rays and all of that nuclear physics stuff, hopefully you'll see that there's an application for it that has worth in the real world and helps us develop our oil fields and, of course, ultimately pay our salaries. Actually, as well as our salaries to consider, there is the cost of the logging job itself. Typically, when we go and log an oil well, we spend a couple of days doing so, and putting these tools down the hole would typically cost anywhere from, say, £200,000 to maybe even as much as £2 million for a couple of days worth of work. So it's a very expensive business, and it's important that we get the best value from these tools and measurements. So what do we need to know in petrophysics? Well, I've sort of split things up into 4 categories here. Basically, what a petrophysicist needs to know is the type of rock in our reservoirs. So what I have here is an example of say some magma rock, some lava that's cooled down, a granite. Here I've got a representation of a mud rock. So this is the shale or a mud that you might find on a riverbank. Here is some sandstone, so sand you might find on a beach, and over here is a traditional shading for what's called limestone. So those are rocks deposited directly from the water. They crystallize out from the water. This carbonate crystallizes out from the sea and is laid down at the bottom of the sea. A good example is the chalk. The white cliffs of Dover are in fact carbonate rocks. So we need to know what rock type we have in our reservoirs. Then we need to know how many holes they have in the rocks, because obviously the holes are where we can store oil in. So for example, in this first example, we have the basement rock or the magma rock, and it might have a few cracks and joints in it, and those holes we may be able to fill some oil up in them, put some oil in there. We also have some holes potentially in the shales or the mud rocks. Now these holes are very, very small, and often they're isolated from each other. They don't connect up to each other, but nevertheless we may find that this rock can contain holes. In the sandstone, here I've shown lots of little holes between the sand grains, and you can imagine, when you remember on a beach, you've got water inside the sand itself, and so depending on how many holes we have depends on how much water or oil your sandstone sponge, if you like, could hold. In the carbonate rocks, they're much more variable. There's a whole bunch of different mechanisms for producing porosity in the rock. That's porosity is what we're primarily interested in. That's the fraction of the rock that's holes, if you like. So here we see various sand-like grains, some oolite beach, some of the beaches in the Bahamas and stuff, you might see some little grains that are in fact made out of carbonate rather than sand. We have little shell fragments here, little fossils that leach out and leave little vugs in the carbonate rock, and all of these holes, and sometimes they may be isolated, so not connected to anything, and sometimes there may be pathways that are leached out, dissolved away by meteoric water. So there's a whole range of stuff, a whole range of complications in carbonate porosity. So the third thing we need to know, of course, is what fluids are actually in this pore space. So we've got a porosity, and what we're interested in the petrophysics side, certainly the oil industry side, is to see what fluids are contained within these holes. So here, let's go straight to the sandstone example. Here I've sort of filled this rock up with some fluid, and at the bottom here we've got water, and we've got oil floating on the top. Oil is less dense than water, so oil tends to float towards the top of our reservoirs and sit in the top of our sponges. And similarly here in the carbonate porosity system. Shall I fill that up again? because I quite like that. It's one of my favourite animations. Let's just fill it up with fluid, so you can imagine the fluid sitting there in the sponge. You'll notice here that in the shale I didn't fill these holes up because it's difficult, if not impossible, to get oil into these isolated pores. And in fact what we find is that shale, mud rocks, often form over the top of our reservoirs and actually hold oil in. That's what they call a trap. So that traps the oil in our reservoir structure, and once the oil hits these shale layers it can go no further and stays trapped in the reservoir. The fourth element that I'm going to touch on is flow. Obviously all this rock can contain fluid, and some of it comes out more easily than others. And so if we just represented this by tipping this up, and you can see how much fluid flows from the rock. And this property of the rock is called permeability. And in fact, so given a pressure differential here, that's in this case because I'm tipping it up, it's gravity, that's the force that's driving the fluids through these rocks. We've got to try and get some sort of estimate of how permeable rocks are, because that's ultimately controls how much oil we can get out of our oil wells and how fast we can produce them, and hence how much money we can make from them. So in essence, that's pretty much all petrophysics is about, really. Those four elements: the rock, what type of rock it is, we need to know that; the volume, i.e. how much porosity it has, how much storage capacity it has; the fluid type within that volume, that pore space. It's obviously, as oil reservoir engineers, we're interested in trying to get oil out. Other engineers may want to know how well their aquifers are, how much water is available to them, but for us in the oil field it's the oil that pays the wages. And also the flow characteristics. How good is this rock at producing oil to the well bores and out at surface? So that's on a rock scale. If we have a look on a reservoir scale, if we take a big slab of rock now this is the only equation in this presentation. This is the equation for how much oil is in our oil reservoirs. So if we have a big tank of sand here, there are a number of elements in which petrophysics plays an important role in inputs into this equation. So this is stock tank oil initially in place. So the volume of oil within this reservoir is given by this equation here, and I'll explain some of these terms as we go. So first up is net to gross. That's the net reservoir over the whole fraction. So if we put some of those mud rocks in, those shales, that will reduce the amount of storage capacity of the reservoir by some amount. So in this case, the net to gross is the proportion of reservoir that has sandstone in it, and versus the proportion of non-reservoir shales. As I mentioned before, there's the porosity. If we take a look down here, how many holes are there in this sandstone? How much oil can it soak up? And the other bit of petrophysical input is the oil saturation itself. How much oil is in the pore space? So we've got some holes to put oil in. How much oil actually gets in? And the GRV, the gross rock volume. Petrophysics can even have an input into that through the contacts. As I mentioned to you before, oil floats on top of water here, and at some point the water will rise to a certain level, and so the gross rock volume of our reservoir package, might be defined by the amount of this rock above this oil-water contact, where the oil floats on top of the water. So that will control this volume. So petrophysics is quite key to determining overall how much oil is in our reservoirs. So what we need to do as petrophysicists is we need to drill some holes in the reservoir and put some measuring devices in there. So put those tools that I mentioned down through these holes and make some measurements in these rocks to determine how much oil is in place in the wellbore.